What if your entire life was a lie? What if everyone you trusted was acting and the world itself was built around you, not to celebrate you, but to contain you? That's Truman Burbank's reality. He's a man who knows deep in his bones that something is very wrong with his life. So he searches for his real self and he finds a way out, a way to begin again. Now that might be the plot of the great 1997 movie, The Truman Show, but the real question the film asks is this: if Truman can escape his prison, can you escape yours? Because that's what makes The Truman Show brilliant. It's about something we all face. See, Truman's story isn't just about fleeing a TV set. It's about evading the subtle prison of other people's expectations. And I think we all know this experience, the exhausting performance of being the person everybody wants us to be, or smiling when we don't feel like it, and living small because it keeps everybody else comfortable. We've all been there, and perhaps you're there right now. But here's the thing about comfortable cages. They're still cages. Truman figures this out, and he walks away from a perfect life into an uncertain one, while the whole world watches, while the whole world cheers. So let's talk about why. Welcome back to Philosophical Film Club. So, Truman escapes. But can we? And could this blockbuster feel-good 90s flick actually have a profound message? I think so. And I'll try to convince you by looking at 6 key steps in Truman's own journey, which are the childish selves we get trapped in, like human, what happens when the systems we're trapped in inevitably break, the choice that we all eventually confront in all of its uncertainty, the adulthood that follows and the second self we have to build, what a cheering audience actually means and why it is a trap, and how Truman's daring escape might be a guide for our own, much less cinematic, much more real journeys. But it may have been a minute since you've seen The Truman Show. So what actually happens in the film? Well, in it, we meet Truman Burbank, your average, everyday suburban husband, living the perfect American life in an idyllic little town called Sea Haven. Every morning, he kisses his wife goodbye, he waves to the same neighbours, he grabs his newspaper, he heads to work, and all with a cheerful catchphrase.
Oh, and in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
And here's what Truman doesn't know, but everybody else does. Sea Haven isn't actually a town at all. It's a sealed soundstage the size of a small city. And his wife, and his best friend, and his neighbours, and his mother, they're all actors. They've been playing the roles his entire life, while everything from his birth to brushing his teeth in the morning is broadcast live to a global audience. Because at that birth, Truman became the first human being ever to be adopted by a corporation. Because...
Corporations are people, my friend. We can raise taxes on... Of course they are. Everything corporations earn ultimately goes to people.
That bit's not in the movie, by the way. That's just Mitt Romney slowly losing an election, and it lives rent-free in my head. Anyway, the puppet master orchestrating all of this is Christoph. He is the calm, godlike producer who controls everything from his control room in the sky, whether it be, well, the weather, or the traffic patterns, even the timing of Truman's seemingly chance encounters at the grocery store. He's basically what would happen if a helicopter parent had unlimited funding in a Messiah complex. He's kept Truman trapped on the island through a carefully manufactured childhood trauma involving water and the death of his father, also an actor and still very much alive. The town is designed with one bridge out and a whole network of smiling deterrents to prevent Truman from ever wanting to leave. But no system is perfect, and the little errors, they start piling up. A stage light falls out of the clear blue sky and Truman sees it. Truman's car radio accidentally picks up crew chatter, with someone literally narrating his movements before he even makes them. An elevator opens onto an unfinished set, and there's just plywood and scaffolding and catering, where there should be another floor. And then there's Sylvia, an extra he fell in love with years ago, who tried to tell him the truth before she was hastily removed from the cast. So Truman starts testing the edges of his world in small ways. He takes a spontaneous drive out of town, sending everybody scrambling. He tries to book an overseas holiday, but what would you know? The entire world is booked up. Bad luck. The bus out of town, Truman storms, breaks down immediately, as does every other way of getting out. There's even a conveniently timed nuclear leak to turn him back home. His best friend starts delivering these oddly comforting monologues that sound suspiciously like they're written because, of course, they are written by Christoph. But eventually, Truman beats them, digging up from his basement and disappearing Great Escape style. He makes it to the water and, swallowing every fear that he has, he takes a small sailboat towards the horizon. Of course, the god of this Potemkin village, Christoph, will not have this, and he dials up a massive storm to stop Truman, because the entire show only functions if Truman stays put. But Truman holds on through the storm, and when it finally blows out, his boat glides forward until it hits something impossible, a painted sky that turns out to be the curved wall of his dome-shaped prison. He finds a staircase built into the wall and climbs up to a door marked Exit. And for the first time in his 30 years, he hears the voice of his creator speaking to him directly from the heavens, trying to convince him that the safe, controlled world he's known is better than any of the uncertainty waiting outside. But Truman just bows to his invisible audience, delivers his familiar sign-off one last time, and he steps through that door into a world we never get to see. Meanwhile, in bars and living rooms around the world and shower baths, don't ask, where people have been watching this man's ordinary life for decades, there's a cheer, a moment of genuine emotion. They cheer their main character as he disappears and the show ends. And so does the film. So, that's the plot. But what is this movie about? And how is it philosophical? That's what we'll tackle next, with a whistle-stop tour of some of Western philosophy and a little bit of Buddhism too. But here's the weird thing about the Truman Show for me. I think it resonates with a lot of us because we've been through something like it too. Not being watched by the world like Truman is, but having to grow up and make choices and face uncertainty and consequences. And there's something almost plucked from our childhoods in this movie here, because it centers around this belief that the whole world is constructed for you, that everything might be happening because of you and for your benefit, even the suspicion that others might be actors in your life to accomplish something meaningful for you. I think that's a pretty common childhood delusion, but it's one that we all grow out of slowly and painfully. So let's have a look at that carefully structured childhood world, courtesy of the life of Truman Burbank. And we can't talk about Truman Burbank's life without talking about the machine that runs Truman Burbank's life. That is the clockwork town of Sea Haven. Because every morning the lights come up right when Truman wakes. The neighbours hit their marks and wait, frozen in anticipation. The streets are perfectly swept and every yard is camera ready in this live-action Norman Rockwell painting. Because this isn't just a charming small town. In the film, it's also acting as a training facility. And what do I mean by that? Well, first, let's think about what being watched all the time, like an animal in a zoo, does to you, whether you know it or not. It slowly shapes you. And most importantly, it makes you learn to be readable. You know, protagonist material, predictable, safe. Because messy people cause problems, and problems get themselves managed. And in the world of The Truman Show, problems don't make good television. Okay, so this film was well before our current generation of love and housewives-based reality shows, but you get the idea. And this readability, whether on screen or not, was a key theme of the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who I've referred to a fair few times on this channel because he's actually the philosopher I specialise in. He's sometimes referred to it as the power of visibility or the gaze, because when you know you're being observed by others, you automatically edit yourself. You walk straighter, you smile on cue, you become the version of yourself that plays well to an audience. He wrote about it extensively in one of his major works, Discipline and Punish, although he wrote about it in a bunch of his other works too. And I've read this book so many times, Foucault himself would probably put me under surveillance for suspicious intellectual behaviour. And Foucault's most powerful insight in that particular book, for me, concerned a mythical prison called the Panopticon. This was a prison designed by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham as kind of like a humane alternative to prisons at the time, where the guards could observe all of the prisoners all of the time without being seen themselves. Does this sound a little familiar? Well, Foucault's point, which I think is a pretty intuitive one these days, is that visibility like that becomes internalized as discipline. The prisoners modify their behavior, not because they're necessarily actually being watched at the time, but because they might be being watched at any moment. It might sound a bit familiar, as I've said, because for me, these days, Foucault's work on surveillance is becoming more and more relevant than ever. Because we built our own panopticons, but we somehow made them worse than Foucault's version. At least his prisoners weren't expected to like and subscribe. Which, by the way, Philibot keeps an eye on me night and day, so please like and subscribe. And Truman's situation is even more sophisticated and layered. He doesn't know about the cameras at all, yet the entire architecture of Sea Haven shapes his behaviour through what Foucault would call disciplinary power, and for the benefit of the cameras. The observation, even though Truman doesn't know it's for TV, shapes everything in his perfect island because everybody else knows and alters themselves. And in the process, they alter Truman's environment and Truman himself. Observation and surveillance is simply the water that everybody in Sea Haven swims in. The island's layout, the timing of the encounters, even the placement of products in stores, all of it functions as a distributed surveillance system that makes Truman legible and manageable without him ever seeing the mechanism operating behind the scenes. And this, Foucault argues, is how power works most effectively in modern societies, not through overt coercion, although there is some of that sometimes, but through environments that make certain behaviours feel natural, while others become almost unthinkable. They become managed out of the picture. And the genius of Sea Haven is that it achieves total surveillance, or almost, while maintaining the illusion of freedom, creating what Foucault calls docile bodies, subjects who discipline themselves by their own volition, shaping themselves to become almost exactly what their jailers want. And the sociologist Erving Goffman, who's fascinating and you should check out, argues in one of his books that all of social life involves a kind of theatrical performance, with people constantly managing the impressions they make on others through what he called front stage and backstage behaviours. In the office, we even call this perception management, my least favourite set of words of all time. We present different versions of ourselves depending on our audience and its context. And this isn't necessarily false or manipulative, it's just kind of how selves and how human social interaction actually work. I mean, Goffman observed them in minute detail as a sociologist. But Truman's situation represents a pathological extreme of Goffman's insight. His entire life is front stage, with no backstage space at all where he can drop the performance and simply exist without managing anyone's impressions. Even his most private moments, sleeping, bathing, intimate conversations with his wife, are all being consumed by an audience, even if he doesn't know it. Everyone around him knows it, and everyone around him behaves in that way. He gets a weird vibe from all of it. This total collapse of the front stage, backstage distinction, even if Truman doesn't directly know it, helps explain why Sea Haven feels simultaneously natural and suffocating. Truman is performing the role of someone living an authentic life, but a true authentic life requires spaces where the performance can stop. In this film, Truman plays that out in front of his bathroom mirror, one of the few spaces he thinks he has to be himself.
I hereby proclaim this planet Trumania.
And it's heartbreaking when viewed through Goffman's lens because it's the closest thing Truman has to backstage behaviour. But even that moment of apparent privacy is being broadcast to millions. Even the care is part of the system. The town is safe, it's sunny, and it's endlessly pleasant. Now, safety isn't the enemy here, but safety at any cost, like Truman experiences, that's the kind of bubble-wrapped paternal care that keeps Truman exactly where he is and exactly where they want him. We even discover that his mother, also an actor, has faked whole illnesses to keep Truman stuck in his town and on screen. And here's what's brilliant about The Truman Show for me, as a metaphor for our own lives, because it is exactly how childhood works. It's almost like Truman is trapped in a perpetual childhood. Because in the best case scenario, childhood is a curated world where adults, they smooth out the rough edges, where the house runs on routines and everyone's role is clear. You learn who you are through other people's expectations, and for a while that's actually perfect. That's ideal. But the problem comes when that training never ends, or where a parent doesn't want to let it end, where you never have to test whether the person you've been performing can actually survive in a world that wasn't designed to flatter and to fit you, that does have rough edges. So Truman's first challenge isn't dramatic. It's almost a little bit of an invisible challenge in the film. He's swimming in that water that constantly whispers, "Be this way," until this way feels like his nature. Although for us, the metaphorical challenge of Sea Haven is even more relevant and very political, because some of the paternalistic regimes citizens live under in our own very un-Hollywood world actually have their own Christophs. They are regimes that shape behaviours, that make all of the decisions for you, and that present you with danger or coercion, in Truman's case a storm, but in ours potentially worse, when we do not comply. But Foucault isn't a fatalist, quite the opposite. He points out that most systems of power aren't perfect. They can't be, and they break. And even when they do operate with the greatest force, that force creates its own sites of resistance, places where people can subtly or overtly oppose them, where their systems overreach or miscalculate. And this starts happening in the film. We, the audience, join the broadcast of The Truman Show, and he discovers that, simply through the nature of the power being exerted against him, that he can start to make it glitch, and he can start to make it malfunction, perhaps even to break it down. And I know a lot of you out there love The Matrix as a philosophical film, but The Matrix is basically exactly the same film as The Truman Show. And both of them, all they're really about is you have a system that's preventing you from being things you want to be or denying you certain freedoms. How do you see it first, and how do you work against it? And part of that, as I'll get to in a second, is seeing the system glitch and break and realising it's not inevitable, that it isn't perfectly run and it isn't the way things have to be. You can actually have things be very different. So what happens when the system breaks? Well, as we see with Truman, firstly it tries to convince you that there's nothing wrong, no malfunction, no service interruption, just business as usual, if you look away. In short, it asks us not to believe our lying eyes, and it offers us further comfort as a reward. And yes, I'm very desperately trying to avoid a red pill, blue pill Matrix analysis here, because unfortunately that's been acquired and misinterpreted for a whole bunch of things. We see this throughout the film as the radio and the newspaper broadcast more and more ridiculous propaganda to try and convince Truman that he should stop paying attention and that nothing is wrong. And it offers him comfort as a reward, because here's the simple but devastating frame for how this psychological containment actually works. Sea Haven systematically mutes three basic facts of human experience that might otherwise jolt someone awake. First, change gets softened into predictable loops, so nothing really ever moves forward. The same neighbours appearing at the same time, the same conversations cycling through their familiar beats, the same pleasant rhythms playing out day after day, like a song stuck on repeat. Second, genuine discomfort gets painted over with smiles and convenient diversions, so that nothing ever stings enough to force a real choice or demand actual growth. And third, a fixed identity gets constantly reflected back through every interaction, through every relationship, every mirror, so that the person never has to wonder who they are or confront the terrifying possibility of who they might become if they stopped performing this particular version of themselves. Truman experiences this in its most coercive form at his workplace, where the work he does is especially meaningless because he's on a TV show. He's not actually selling or doing contracts or really anything. But the actors insist on placing stress and demands on him anyway to get him to comply and to replicate the office environment authentically for their audiences. But it's really pointless and cruel. And Simone de Beauvoir understood something about this. She said that we're always shaped by what she called our situation, the concrete circumstances, the relationships, and the social structures we find ourselves embedded in. But she rejected any form of determinist approach or determinism or fatalism that would make us passive victims of those circumstances. Instead, she argued that we retain what she called situated freedom, the capacity to transcend our situation through action. Even when the situation seems overwhelmingly constraining, there are still choices, although they come with costs. Truman's situation appears to determine everything about his life, where he goes, whom he meets, even what he thinks and feels. But de Beauvoir would point out to him that the situation only has power over him as long as he accepts that it is natural and that it's inevitable. The moment he begins to see Sea Haven as a situation rather than as a simple reality, he recovers his freedom to act against it. This is why the seams that start to show, the breakdowns, matter so much, because they reveal that what seemed like an unchangeable reality is actually a constructed situation. And constructed situations can be dismantled through conscious choice and through persistent action. Or alternately, as Foucault and other philosophers might say, nothing is necessary, everything is contingent. It could have been and could still be different. Now, Western philosophy gives us surprisingly plain language for what this kind of arrangement does to a person's, being over time. Jean-Paul Sartre called it bad faith, the human tendency to settle into a comfortable role precisely to avoid the burden of freedom and the anxiety of genuine choice. It's not malicious, it's understandable. Freedom is exhausting and choice is terrifying. It's much easier, let the role do the choosing for you. And as I think we've talked about on this channel a few times before, Kierkegaard also identifies a subtler version of the same track, calling it despair. Not through some sort of dramatic hand-wringing kind we might imagine, but it's just that quiet feeling that grows when your life is technically fine, it's successful, maybe even pleasant, but somehow it doesn't feel like it's truly yours. It's the existential equivalent of living on a diet of cotton candy. It might be sweet and satisfying in the moment, but it leaves you persistently malnourished. Now, we don't need to diagnose Truman clinically to see this existential malnutrition playing out in his daily life. He laughs at the same jokes with the same timing. He delivers his catchphrase with the same cheerful enthusiasm, an almost robotic one. He goes through all the expected motions of a man living a good life. And then, when the cameras aren't focused on him, or when he thinks they aren't, he lies awake staring at the ceiling, because something in him remains persistently underfed. Something no amount of pleasant routine can quite satisfy. And believe it or not, there's a Buddhist resonance here too that helps name the particular itch without getting too mystical or philosophically technical about it. Because when a world becomes too smooth, when every rough edge is just sanded away, it inadvertently hides the very frictions and resistances that help us develop as human beings. Because real life, as we all know, has sharp corners, dead ends, unexpected storms. And those difficulties teach us things about our own resilience, our own adaptability, and depth that we simply cannot learn in a world that's just designed to keep us comfortable. If nothing ever truly ends, if nothing ever truly bites, if your sense of identity is never allowed to loosen a bit and reshape itself through contact with genuine and unexpected challenge, you don't just stop growing, you start to atrophy, which is where we find Truman Burbank. Because the pleasant cage works precisely by keeping your attention drowsy and your deeper questions comfortably quiet. When things break, we snap out of our sleep and we start paying attention. This is the real hinge of Truman's story, and honestly of any movement towards genuine adulthood. You eventually reach a point when you face a stark choice. You can either deepen the performance and get better at playing the role that everybody expects from you, or you can start testing whether there's something more real and more alive waiting outside. And one path promises more of the same pleasant predictability. The continued approval of your audience, the safety of never having to discover who you might be if you stop being who you've always been. And you might know a few people that have opted for this path, and there's no shame in it. But they're those people who've stayed in their hometown perhaps, or gone into the professions that their parents chose for them, done exactly as their teachers and their peers expected them to. A life of predictable performance, like Truman's. But the other path asks us to give up the guarantee that tomorrow will be easy or comfortable or even recognizable. Because the truth that's hidden by the alternate path is that even if you take the predictable path, it can't guarantee that either. The other path asks us to risk the possibility that we'll be fundamentally changed by whatever we find outside our little dome. Truman begins to lean towards that second, more dangerous option. And from this point forward, the seams of his world really start to burst apart and matter in ways that they never did before. Truman's investigation evolves from a private suspicion into active experimentation. He starts breaking his established routines in small but deliberate ways. He drives where the script clearly doesn't want him to go. He walks into a travel agency and he tries to buy a ticket to somewhere, anywhere outside of Sea Haven. Each attempt produces immediate interference that would be laughably obvious if it weren't so perfectly timed. There are no seats available or any flight, or sudden road closures that materialised overnight, a bus that mysteriously won't start just as he's about to board. Truman tests his world the way the rest of us test our Wi-Fi, with growing frustration and the dawning realisation that someone else controls the connection. And that brings us to an important cognitive point that it's worth kind of making explicit. Seams and anomalies don't hand you absolute certainty about what's really happening. That's more the realm of paranoid schizophrenia. But they do shift the burden of proof in a fundamental way. After enough of them accumulate in your experience, the default assumption of this is just how the world naturally works no longer automatically earns its place in your worldview, and you become entitled to act on a different working theory, even if you can't verify every detail of it in advance. Because the secret is, at least for human structures and human societies, there is no natural way they're supposed to work. That's precisely where Truman finds himself at this next stage of his journey. He hasn't solved the puzzle of his existence yet or gained a complete understanding of the system that contains him. He'll kind of never get that, but he does know enough to stop living as if nothing unusual is happening, enough to stop pretending that his growing unease is just paranoia or ingratitude. And as I've talked about on the channel before, the philosopher Martin Heidegger gave us a concept that's really useful here called thrownness. The idea that we're born into circumstances we didn't choose, in a time and place and family situation that shapes us in a way before we're capable of making conscious decisions about who we are and what we want to become. But that's just the arrival. That doesn't necessarily represent us going forward. And Truman represents an extreme version of this condition. He's literally thrown into an artificial world designed by others with no say in the fundamental parameters of his existence. But Heidegger's more crucial insight is that this thrownness, it isn't destiny. Despite being shaped by our circumstances beyond our control, and perhaps being even shaped to desire or want certain things, we retained what he called the capacity for authentic existence, the ability to own our choices and to create meaning rather than simply drifting along with whatever current we find ourselves in. When Truman finally takes that boat towards the horizon, he's enacting what Heidegger called resoluteness, choosing his own most possibilities despite having no guarantee about what he's going to find. The storm that Christoph sends represents everything in us that prefers the safety of inauthenticity to the risk of becoming who we actually are. And there comes a point in any genuine crisis where collecting more clues about it stops helping, and the only honest move left is to choose. Truman reaches exactly this moment at the climax of the film. He's accumulated enough seams and anomalies to show with reasonable certainty that the world he's living in is artificially arranged around him. But he can't quite prove the entire conspiracy from first principles the way you might solve a mathematical theorem. And if he waits for a level of absolute certainty, he'll be waiting forever. That's the problem of fundamental choice, stated in its starkest terms. Do you act on incomplete but compelling evidence, or do you stay put because the test can never be perfect and the proof can never be absolute? The show fights back against Truman's growing independence exactly where most of us tend to hesitate when facing our own version of this choice, at the price point, at the moment when the true cost of freedom becomes visible and undeniable. Christoph raises a massive storm that could easily kill him. His closest friends repeat their most comforting and manipulative lines, trying to lure him back into the safety of familiar routines, trying to tell him that he's wrong or that, oh, that's risky, or I wouldn't do that, or, all of these familiar things we hear. The entire town flashes with hazard signs and warning signals, all of them delivering the same seductive message. Stay where you are, it's safer here. And here's the most honest part of the entire film. And the thing that I think a lot of people who talk about you making radical decisions and changing your life often don't admit. Those flashing signs, they're absolutely right. It is safer. Staying in Sea Haven, continuing to play the comfortable role everyone expects, accepting the comfortable cage and the predictable pleasures it provides, all of that is genuinely the safer choice by any reasonable measure. But safety and truth are not necessarily the same thing. And Truman has reached the point where he can no longer pretend for him that they are. Leaving Sea Haven for him doesn't promise him a better life in any conventional sense, more success or more comfort or more reliable happiness. All that it promises is the hope of a truer life, one that hasn't been focus grouped or market tested or designed in every inch to keep him contentedly manageable. And the truth, as anyone who has ever chosen it over comfort can tell you, typically arrives with its own weather system. The storm that Khrushchev unleashes really is just the tax you pay for admission to a life you haven't previewed. The price, in other words, of growing up. What makes Truman's final choice genuinely compelling is how refreshingly ordinary it becomes once you strip away all of the Hollywood spectacle and the special effects. He doesn't deliver a stirring manifesto at the end of the film, a climactic speech about the nature of reality or the importance of authentic living. He doesn't make any grand proclamations about his newfound understanding of the human condition like I would. Instead, he does what people do when they make these real-life decisions. He changes his routine despite fear, he endures genuine physical and emotional discomfort, and he keeps moving forward when the water gets rough and the outcome remains uncertain. And when someone who claims to know him better than he knows himself offers him the false comfort of staying exactly where he is, he simply says no. That's, for me, I think, the actual shape of some of the most meaningful decisions we take in ordinary human life. Not dramatic speeches or heroic gestures, but small, concrete actions that quietly close certain doors behind you and open up others that maybe you can't even see clearly. The practical takeaway for those of us living our own versions of this dilemma is, I think, a simple rule of thumb that you can actually apply in your own situations, because often I feel like that's what some of the best philosophy does. When you've accumulated enough evidence that a particular situation, whether it's a job, a relationship, a living situation, or even the digital feeds that shape your daily attention, consistently keep you smaller than you need to be. And when that system or that situation actively blocks or discourages your every reasonable attempt you make to test its boundaries, to grow, or to do something differently, stop waiting for that perfect proof that will never arrive. Instead, decide what ultimately matters to you more, the safety of the known or the reality of the unknown. Then act in concrete ways that make your answer true and irreversible. From this point forward, Truman's journey, when he makes this decision, changes from a story about growing suspicion into something much more fundamental, a story about the ongoing work of becoming a real person in a real world. But making that choice, as hard as it may be at the time, is the easy bit. It's the living after that decision that's hard, and as Truman discovers. Because after the choice comes the work of becoming. And the film is remarkably clear about this transformation without ever saying it out loud or turning it into a lesson. Truman doesn't discover some hidden true self waiting under the floorboards like a treasure that was always there, patiently waiting to be unearthed by the right combination of therapy and self-reflection. Instead, he builds a workable self by doing different things and keeping going when those things become frightening or uncertain or simply unfamiliar or even just, at the most basic level, uncomfortable. That, I think, is the most practical version of Nietzsche's famous challenge to become who you are. A phrase that sounds mystical until you realise it's pretty concrete and pretty doable. You don't find your authentic self through introspection or through personality tests alone. Instead, you make it through a series of actions and commitments that wouldn't fit into the smaller shape you used to inhabit. You change by doing things, not by thinking about things, if that makes sense. You act your way into a life that can then hold more complexity, more uncertainty, and more genuine relationship than the role you originally were trained to play. And at the same time, I think there's a crucial correction from Buddhist thinking that prevents this Nietzschean self-creation project from becoming just another ego inflation trip. If building a second self simply means constructing a bigger, shinier identity that demands even more attention and more validation from the world, then we'll inevitably recreate the cage that we were already in, with better branding and with more sophisticated props this time, perhaps. Instead, I think the somewhat Buddhist concept of non-self helps here, because it doesn't mean erasing your personality or dissolving into some sort of formless cosmic consciousness. It means loosening your death grip on that very understandable and human need to be at the centre of every frame, the star of every interaction, or the main character whose comfort and preferences drive every decision. You still have a name, a personal history, a distinct point of view, and particular talents and limitations, even when you're a Buddhist. You just stop insisting that the entire world arrange itself around your psychological needs before you're willing to meet it on its own terms. And personally, I think that this shift, this just very slight shift in thinking, makes everything a bit lighter. Because not every story you experience depends on you. And somewhat paradoxically, thinking that way also makes us more genuinely available to other people because we're no longer constantly managing our image or protecting our brand or worrying about what it means for us to be involved in this particular thing at this particular time. Sometimes you can just stop and enjoy the sunlight on your skin. Put together, I'd argue that these two philosophical approaches give us a remarkably practical picture of what a healthy adult development actually looks like in concrete terms, even if philosophical ones. The Nietzschean direction of self-overcoming points us forward into new territory. We should take on new commitments, we should develop skills, and we should build relationships that stretch us in ways that won't allow us to shrink back into our previous shapes. Meanwhile, the Buddhist practice of loosening our grip a little on centrality works from the inside. We no longer have to protect a carefully curated image every single minute, which means we can afford to admit when we're wrong. We can start over when necessary, and we can allow ourselves to be genuinely challenged by what we encounter, rather than simply using new experiences to confirm what we already believe about ourselves. Growing up, in this view, becomes both movements simultaneously. Strong enough to make difficult choices and commit to their consequences, but relaxed enough to keep learning and adapting when reality doesn't quite match our expectations, as it inevitably will. I think we can hear this delicate balance embodied perfectly in the way Truman finally leaves Sea Haven. I know it's only a small gesture, but I think it conveys a lot. He bows to his invisible audience, which represents a small but significant act of respect for the life he's stepping out of, acknowledging that it wasn't entirely false, even if it was ultimately too small for him. Then he smiles, which I think communicates a kind of Buddhist acceptance without bitterness. He's not leaving in anger or resentment, but simply because it's time to go. And then he walks through that door into complete uncertainty without delivering a speech about who he plans to become next, without announcing a new identity or making grand statements about his future self. No new title, no manifesto, no rebranding, just the first quiet move of a person who expects to be fundamentally remade by whatever he finds on the other side. And the film refuses to give us an epilogue on purpose. We don't get to see a wonderful reunion with Sylvia or the discovery of a new city that appreciates his authentic self or the perfect job Truman finds himself in that finally makes use of his real talents. Instead, we see a door and a choice. And then the credits roll while we're still processing what it means to step through that threshold. And this restraint is one of the strengths of the film for me. I think it's brutally honest about what adulthood actually entails. Growing up isn't about graduating into a new script with better dialogue and more interesting plot developments. It's about developing the capacity to begin again without guarantees and to live with being continuously changed by whatever you encounter next, even when those changes are uncomfortable or inconvenient. And the philosopher Hannah Arendt, I think, gives us a really useful term for this fundamental human capacity. She calls it natality, the power to start something genuinely new rather than simply repeating established patterns or fulfilling predetermined roles. The concept, I think, fits Truman's situation perfectly because the most important fact about him at the end of the film isn't who he becomes or what kind of life he builds on the other side of that door. What matters is that he has recovered his ability to begin again, to initiate something that doesn't already exist in the world's catalogue of acceptable possibilities. That capacity for genuine beginning is what distinguishes a living person from a character in someone else's story, and it's what makes the ending hopeful without being too sentimental. An open ending also strategically protects the film's deeper point from collapsing into simple-minded fantasy or cautionary tale. If the movie had shown us Truman thriving immediately in his new life, finding love, meaningful work, and genuine community within the first, few scenes of his new life, the lesson would have been shrunk down to something like, leave your comfortable prison and you'll be instantly rewarded with everything you ever wanted. If, on the other hand, it had shown him struggling, confused, or regretting his decision, the takeaway would have been contracted into, leave your safe situation and you'll inevitably suffer for your foolishness. But the actual truth about any transition from false comfort to genuine reality is both more complex and more honest than either of those simplified narratives. You leave the familiar cage, and then real life starts with all of its unpredictable mixture of difficulty and possibility, disappointment and discovery. Real life, as I think we all know, is irreducibly mixed. And keeping the narrative frame wide enough to accommodate that complexity makes space for viewers to imagine their own version of what that kind of courage might look like. This is precisely where Truman's story loops back to illuminate, I think, our own contemporary situation. Most of our personal sea havens these days are actually, I'd argue, algorithmic rather than architectural. They're feeds carefully curated to keep us comfortable and engaged. They're daily routines designed to remove friction and eliminate surprise, like immediately checking our phones on waking up. Or they're digital dashboards that pre-sort what we see and hear to match our established preferences and our confirmed biases. The open door that Truman walks through isn't just a plot device in a 25-year-old movie. It's an ongoing question about how we choose to structure our actual lives. Do we want days that play well to the same familiar audience of friends, family, and followers who already know our brand and expect us to stay consistent with it? Or do we want days that regularly expose us to people and places and ideas that might genuinely change us, even if that change involves temporary discomfort or the loss of certain comforting certainties? There isn't a single right answer to that question, by the way. It's a question that works for everyone in every season of life in different ways. But there is definitely a cost associated with either choice, and pretending that both options are equally safe or equally demanding is exactly how you end up unconsciously drifting back into a set of your own construction. The comfortable choice isn't always wrong, but it does tend to keep you smaller than what you might otherwise become. The challenging choice isn't automatically superior, but it does require you to develop capacities that you didn't know you needed. So, the credits roll, not because Truman's story has reached its natural conclusion, but because the part of his story that needed an audience to witness and validate it is finally over. What comes next? That's up to us. There's one more character that I think we haven't talked enough about, and that is the audience inside the film. And by extension, us, watching them, watching him. Why would millions of people choose to sit with someone's ordinary life for years, organising their own daily schedules around his breakfast routine and evening walks? I think the answer reveals something both touching and unsettling about how we navigate loneliness in a mediated and digital world. The kind of ordinary life that the Truman Show, the television show and the film allows everybody to witness when it's steady and predictably available, it functions like a kind of companionship that you don't have to manage or maintain. You get the psychological benefits of a daily companion, the sense that somebody familiar is moving through the world alongside you without any of the complicated mess of actual reciprocity. You receive the mood-regulating comfort of shared routine without the emotional risk that genuine intimacy always carries. It's a parasocial relationship, the clinical term that psychologists use, but the feeling I think is just much simpler and more human. It's, I know this person. He's fundamentally safe. He'll be there tomorrow at the same time, doing the same recognizable things. And that predictably smooths out some of the sharp edges that our own uncertain days tend to have. There's also a deeper hunger that shows like The Truman Show satisfy particularly well in our current cultural moment. They provide what we might call an authenticity fix that becomes increasingly valuable as more of our daily experience feels scripted, curated, performative, ad-sponsored. When you're living in a culture saturated with performance, where everyone from politicians to influencers to your own social media friends seem to be constantly managing their image and selling things to you, you start desperately craving any signal that feels genuinely spontaneous. Truman's ordinary life scratches that particular itch, I think. And in the more practical psychological payoffs, like a reliable way to pass the time, a gentle suspense that never becomes too stressful, or something safe to discuss with other people, you have the recipe for a habit that feels not just harmless, but almost therapeutic. The genius of the show's cultural penetration becomes clear when you realise how it transforms the individual consumption of The Truman Show into something like a shared ritual. Bars and coffee shops and office break rooms synchronized their schedules around Truman's daily rhythm too. And suddenly what started as a private viewing habit becomes a form of community participation, something that we're all craving more and we're all missing more and more ever since Bowling Alone was published all those decades ago. People who might otherwise have little in common find themselves bonding over their shared investment in this one man's predictable but somehow compelling existence. Community sneaks through in the side door in The Truman Show, and I think in our lives when we follow this kind of stuff, built around the safest possible shared object of attention. And if it's not The Truman Show in your life, which doesn't exist, obviously, maybe it's a favourite television show like Severance, the feeling of community you get out of when that airs and you can talk about it at work, which I definitely did with all of my colleagues, or even sports. So what do viewers actually extract from this arrangement? At the most basic level, they get emotional regulation. They get a calm background hum, punctuated by occasional mild surprises, all of it carefully calibrated to avoid any stakes that might genuinely disturb their equilibrium or show them something shocking. They also get a particular kind of identity work through a constant comparison. Depending on their mood and circumstances, they can use Truman's life to confirm that they're normal, or that they feel a bit better about themselves, or they're refreshingly different, whatever the story the comparison happens to offer on any given day. You know, let's admit it, some of us watch reality TV that's trash because we want to see trash people and feel like we're not trash. And perhaps most powerfully, they receive the psychological comfort of togetherness, but without any of the corresponding responsibility, which is appealing precisely because it delivers something that feels like intimacy while demanding almost nothing in return. And I'd argue that, unfortunately, when push comes to shove, it also ends up giving back nothing in return. That's the real attraction here, I think, and it's worth noting that it isn't fundamentally dark or pathological, although there can be problems with it, but it's recognisably human. It's something I do. It's a reasonable response to the genuine difficulty of maintaining real relationships in a world that often feels very fragmented and demanding. It's also, as I say, a part of why I love watching reality TV. Oh, my eyes. And maybe everybody else does too. But then the ending arrives. And something in The Truman Show that's cleaner and that's more surprising overrides all of these comfortable habits, because people cheer when Truman walks through that door. They do it because, for a crucial moment, recognition beats voyeurism and something deeper than entertainment takes over. He stops being content. He stops being a comforting object for their consumption, and he becomes visible as an actual person making a real choice. And that shift lands in living rooms across the world like collective relief. There's a satisfaction here that runs much deeper than fun or diversion. It's what psychologists sometimes call the eudaimonic payoff, where a story affirms human agency and dignity in ways that make us feel genuinely uplifted, rather than merely entertained. And a Buddhist might turn around and say, oh, well, this is just sympathetic joy. That distinctively human capacity to feel genuinely happy for another person's freedom and flourishing, even when that freedom directly costs you something that you were enjoying. It's one of the best things about us. And in that cheer from the audience in The Truman Show, and I hope from all of us watching the film, I detect something a bit rare these days. I see a little bit of hope. So, we're left with our original question. Truman escapes, but can we? Well, here are a few thoughts from me, inspired roughly by the movie, but informed, I think, by the philosophy and the approaches that we've been talking about so far. Because I think The Truman Show as a film is genuinely useful and profound in illustrating some philosophical concepts that can help us live better lives. And the first of these is paying attention. In a philosophical sense of observing systems and people and thinking about them and trying to understand how they work and why, but also in a Buddhist sense of just stopping to enjoy the warmth of the sun on our skins, or the changing moods of the day, or the tiniest details of life. In both ways, attention is the first step towards stepping outside of ourselves, for philosophers, for Buddhists, for all of us. When Truman starts paying attention to his world, he starts seeing ways out. The second is acknowledging that what has happened is contingent and not necessary. Now, perhaps that's a bit too much of a philosopher's description, but it goes back to what we were talking about with Heidegger. We're thrown into the world. We cannot change what has been. But we can make choices for ourselves going forward, and in doing so, we can change how the world may be. And the third point is, as Simone de Beauvoir and others noted, choice carries risk and the future is uncertain. But take that as a good thing, because if the future was certain, then we wouldn't be free and we wouldn't be able to make choices. And we are, with everything that entails. It also entails compromise, which is hard and it's very annoying. But the nature of adulthood, as Hannah Arendt encouraged us to think about it, is that we should cultivate our natality, our ability to accept that and to start again and to enjoy that starting again and to get up again and again and to try something new. Finally, the film cautions us about being an audience. It's fine to watch trash TV. It's fine to enjoy bad behaviour and to want a figurative escape sometimes. But in doing so, we should avoid becoming trash people too and forcing other people to become trash. Because in doing so, we close off the potential humanity, choices, and escape for others by cheering one outcome or another. And we should also be aware that we might be doing that for ourselves too. So instead, we should cheer for Truman, for his escape. Let's feel a little of that shared compassion and joy for our fellow human beings. It's a great film, and it's a really wonderful reminder. But that's it for this edition of Philosophical Film Club. So until next time, be wise and be kind, and remember to...